He was 14 years old. They executed him in 83 days. 70 years later, a judge said he never should have died. The true story of George Stinney Jr. There is a photograph that exists from 1944. It shows a small boy sitting in an electric chair. He is so small that the guards had to stack books beneath his feet so the straps could reach his legs. The Bible he had been carrying was placed on the seat beneath him to raise him high enough for the electrodes to make contact with his head. He was 14 years old. His name was George Stinney Jr. He weighed 90 pounds. He stood 5 feet 1 inch tall. He was the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. And in 2014, 70 years after they killed him, a judge ruled that his trial had been a fundamental miscarriage of justice, that his conviction should never have happened, that he had been denied every protection the law was supposed to give him. 70 years. George Stinney Jr. was dead for 70 years before the American legal system admitted what it had done to him. This is his story. It is true. Every detail of it is documented. And it is one of the most painful and important stories in American history, because it is not just the story of one child. It is the story of a system that was built to fail certain people, and of a family that spent 7 decades refusing to let the truth stay buried. Remember that. The truth stayed buried for 70 years. It came out anyway, because some truths cannot be permanently silenced, no matter how hard the people in power try. George Stinney Jr. was born on October 21, 1929, in Pinewood, South Carolina. He was the third of 8 children born to George Stinney Sr. and Annie Stinney. The family lived in Alcolu, a small mill town in Clarendon County, in the eastern part of South Carolina. Alcolu was the kind of town where everything was organized around the lumber mill and where the social order was rigid and unforgiving. In 1944, Alcolu was a town divided. White residents lived on one side of the railroad tracks. Black residents lived on the other. The children of each side attended different schools. They played in different spaces. They moved through the same geography as though it were 2 separate worlds sharing one location. George Jr. was described by everyone who knew him as a normal boy. Quiet sometimes. Fond of playing with his younger brothers and sisters, he attended school. He helped his father with chores. He was, by every account of the people who loved him, a child living a child's life in the particular, ordinary way that children do when no one has yet given them reason to be afraid. On March 23, 1944, 2 young girls went missing in Alcolu. Betty June Binnicker was 11 years old. Mary Emma Thames was 7. They had gone out looking for maypop flowers along a road near the edge of town. When they did not come home that evening, their families searched. The next morning, March 24th, their bodies were found in a drainage ditch not far from where the Stinney family lived. They had been beaten to death. The wounds on their heads were consistent with a heavy metal object, possibly a railroad spike, though the specific weapon was never conclusively identified. The town of Alcolu erupted, and within hours, before any formal investigation had been conducted, before any evidence had been gathered and tested, before any serious inquiry had been made, the police arrested George Stinney Jr. He was 14 years old. The police said George had confessed. They said he had told officers that he had lured the girls to look for flowers, had struck them with a spike when Betty June refused his advances, and had assaulted and killed both of them. There was no written confession. There were no witnesses to any confession. There was no evidence that any confession had ever been recorded or signed. What there was the word of white police officers in a South Carolina mill town in 1944, saying that a 14-year-old black boy had confessed. That was enough. George's parents were forced to leave Alcolu within hours of his arrest. They lost their home and their jobs. The family was driven from the town, leaving George completely alone, without his parents, without any family member who could see him or speak to him or advocate for him. He spent the weeks between his arrest and his trial in a jail cell in Columbia, the state capital, more than 50 miles from his family. He was 14 years old. He had never been separated from his family before. He was alone in a jail cell in an unfamiliar city, with no parent, no guardian, no support of any kind. The trial of George Stinney Jr. lasted approximately 3 hours. 3 hours. From the moment the proceedings began to the moment the jury returned its verdict, less than 3 hours passed. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Estimates put the crowd at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people. An overflow crowd stood outside. The atmosphere was not the atmosphere of a court of law deliberating carefully over the life of a child. It was the atmosphere of a conclusion being formalized. George's court-appointed attorney was a man named Charles Plowden. He was a local politician who later ran for elected office in the county. He called no witnesses. He presented no evidence. He offered no defense worth the name. He conducted no cross-examination of the police officers who claimed George had confessed. He made no challenge to the complete absence of physical evidence connecting George to the murders. The entire defense consisted of nothing. The jury was all white. No black person was permitted to serve on a jury in Clarendon County, South Carolina in 1944. Women were not permitted to serve on juries in South Carolina at all until 1967. 12 white men, in a room from which every person who looked like George had been excluded by law, deliberated for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty of murder. Judge Philip Stoll sentenced George Stinney Jr. to death by electrocution. The boy stood in that courtroom and heard those words at 14 years old, in a room full of strangers, without his parents, without any advocate who had genuinely tried to help him, without having been given anything resembling a fair trial. He was taken back to his cell. He was 83 days from the execution. In the weeks between the verdict and the execution, several people made efforts to secure a stay or a commutation. Then AP appealed to South Carolina Governor Olin Johnston, asking him to spare the child's life or, at minimum, to delay the execution until the case could be more thoroughly reviewed. Governor Johnston refused. There was no appeal. There was no higher court review. There was no mechanism in South Carolina in 1944 that automatically triggered a review of a death sentence imposed on a child. The law did not require it. The law in South Carolina in 1944 did not place a special value on the life of a 14-year-old black boy that demanded extraordinary caution. The execution was scheduled for June 16, 1944. On the morning of June 16, George Stinney Jr. was brought from his cell. He walked to the execution chamber carrying a Bible. He was crying. Witnesses who were present described a small, terrified child who could barely hold himself upright. The electric chair in the South Carolina State Penitentiary had been built for adults. George Stinney Jr. was 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 90 pounds. The standard straps did not fit his body. His legs did not reach the floor. Guards stacked books beneath his feet. The Bible he had been carrying was placed on the seat to raise him higher. The electrodes were too large for his small head. The first jolt of electricity did not kill him. The mask they had placed over his face fell away, and witnesses saw his expression. He was still alive. A second jolt was administered, then a third. He died on the third attempt. He was 14 years old. The entire proceeding, from arrest to execution, had taken 83 days. George Stinney Jr. was buried in an unmarked grave. His family carried the knowledge of what had been done to their son and brother across decades. His sister Aim Ruffner, who had been 12 years old when George was executed, gave interviews in her later life describing the morning the girls were found, the questions the police had asked, the events that had followed. She remembered everything. The memory was exact and unforgiving. She said her brother was with her and their younger sister on the morning of March 23, 1944, the day the girls disappeared. She said he had spoken briefly with Betty June and Mary Emma when they came past looking for flowers. She said he had been with his family for the rest of that day. She said he had not done what they said he did. The family never stopped saying it. For 70 years, through the silence of a system that had no interest in revisiting a closed case, through the indifference of institutions that had already decided and moved on, George Stinney's family maintained his innocence. In 2004, the case began attracting renewed attention from journalists and legal advocates. The complete absence of any physical evidence, the missing confession, the 3-hour trial, the 10-minute deliberation, the all-white jury, the 14-year-old boy denied any meaningful defense. It all began to be examined with the eyes of a different era. In 2013, a formal petition was filed in Clarendon County Circuit Court requesting that George Stinney Jr.'s conviction be vacated on the grounds that he had been denied a fair trial. On December 17, 2014, Circuit Court Judge Carmen Mullen issued her ruling. She found that George Stinney Jr. had been denied due process at every stage of his trial, that his counsel had failed to provide any meaningful defense, that the confession claimed by police was of deeply questionable validity, given the circumstances under which it had allegedly been obtained, that the trial had been conducted in an atmosphere so hostile and so racially charged that no fair proceeding had been possible. She vacated the conviction. George Stinney Jr., executed in 1944 at 14 years old, was officially exonerated 70 years after his death. His sister Amy was alive to see it. She was 82 years old. She had been waiting for 70 years. There are several facts about this case that deserve to be held individually because each one is its own measure of what happened. George Stinney Jr. was the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the murders. There was no written confession. There was no signed document. There was no recording. There was only the word of the officers who claimed he had confessed. His trial lasted 3 hours. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes. He had no meaningful legal defense. His parents were forced out of town and out of contact with him before the trial ever took place. The electric chair was too large for his body. His conviction was vacated 70 years after his death. No one else was ever charged with the murders of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. Those two girls, 11 and 7 years old, also deserve to be named. They were real children who died real deaths and whose families also deserved answers. The arrest and execution of a 14-year-old boy, who almost certainly did not kill them, did not bring those families justice. It brought them a performance of justice, a rapid conclusion that satisfied the fury of a town without doing the careful, honest work of finding the truth. Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames were never truly given justice either. Their deaths were used as the occasion for an execution that was really about something else entirely, about a system that needed a verdict and a child who had no power to resist one. George Stinney Jr. was 14 years old. He weighed 90 pounds. He was alone in a jail cell 50 miles from his family. He walked into an execution chamber carrying a Bible. He cried. He was a child. In the decades after his death, his name disappeared from most of the official record. There was no marker on his grave for years. There was no acknowledgement from the state that had killed him. There was no apology. There was no reckoning. There was just the silence that powerful institutions maintain around the things they have done that they cannot justify. But his family did not maintain that silence. His sister remembered. His brothers remembered. The community that had known him remembered. And when the legal challenge finally came, 70 years after the execution, it came partly because the memories had been kept alive by the people who loved him, who never stopped insisting that the story was not finished, that the conclusion that had been forced on them in a 3-hour trial in 1944 was not the truth. The judge agreed. The conviction was vacated. George Stinney Jr. was exonerated. 70 years too late, but the record changed. The official account of what had happened was corrected. The lie that had been placed in the legal record on June 16, 1944, was removed. That is not justice. Justice would have been a fair trial in 1944. Justice would have been a child going home to his family. Justice would have been investigators doing the real work of finding out what actually happened to Betty June and Mary Emma. What happened in 2014 is not justice, but it is the truth being told finally after 70 years of being buried. And that matters. It has to matter. Because if it does not matter, then the 70 years his family spent insisting on it meant nothing. And they meant everything. George Junius Stinney Jr., born October 21, 1929, in Pinewood, South Carolina. Executed June 16, 1944. He was 14 years old. Exonerated December 17, 2014. 70 years after they killed him, the record was corrected. His family waited 70 years to hear it. Remember his name.